Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Tom Connell. The bodies of Andrew Chan and Myuran Sukkar have been taken to Jakarta and are expected to be returned to Australia within the next 2 days. For the families, the grieving process has just begun as they prepare to fly back to Australia with those bodies. But already there is political debate about the role of the Australian Federal Police in this case and potential future cases involving Australians overseas. The AFP gave key intelligence to their Indonesian counterparts way back in 2005 that led to the arrests of the Bali Nine. Lee Rush was the father of one of the would-be heroin smugglers, Scott Rush. Lee phoned an old lawyer friend, Robert Myers, and voiced his fears about what his son might be about to do. Myers then rang the AFP and asked them to intercept Scott Rush before he left Australia on suspicion of illegal activity. Instead, the AFP tipped off Indonesia. 9 days later, Rush was arrested at Bali's Denpasar airport and he was initially given a death sentence. That sentence was commuted to life imprisonment. Of course, Andrew Chan and Myuran Sukkar were not so lucky. And in the wake of the AFP's involvement, Labor made changes to the agency's guidelines in 2009, instructing them to take into account Australia's opposition to the death penalty when dealing with foreign agencies. In 2010, a ministerial direction also said the minister expected the AFP to take account of the government's long-standing opposition to the application of the death penalty in performing its international liaison functions. Last year, that ministerial directive was removed by Justice Minister Michael Keenan, prompting Labor to query today why.
Labor put in place new guidelines, which meant that the police have got a job to do to discourage drug offences, aren't caught in the middle, making decisions which might go to life or death or indeed relations between countries. Now we found out that in the last 24 hours that the current government has reversed some of the protocols that were put into place to try and prevent the tragedy which we saw happen in the early hours of yesterday morning.
There's a contrast between the internal guidelines and the ministerial directive. This doesn't make sense why the government is saying one thing to the AFP and the AFP internally are saying something else. We need this clarified as a matter of urgency. We do not want to see a repeat of what happened to Andrew Chan and Myuran Sukkar.
Justice Minister Michael Keenan has chosen to avoid comment on specifically why the directive was removed, focusing on the fact the AFP guidelines are still in place and still acting as that safeguard.
Well, I think we're confusing two things here. The document that governs the way that Australia deals with the death penalty is there's guidelines which are very explicit for the Australian Federal Police about how they deal with evidence in death penalty cases. Now those guidelines were updated in 2009 by the then Labor government and they are the same today.
It's worth noting Labor raised this concern, or very much publicly writing a letter, yes, to Michael Keenan, but releasing the letter as well before there was a response. There was a stinging rebuke as well from the Foreign Minister, Julie Bishop. She says Labor has taken a cheap shot and that the ministerial directive is a separate document to the guidelines.
24 hours after the death of these two young men, and the Labor Party is getting the media to quibble about the AFP guidelines that are the guidelines under which the AFP operate. They are precisely the same guidelines that Labor put in place. They are precisely the same guidelines that operate today. A ministerial directive is an entirely different document that does not dictate the operational activities of the AFP. I'm not going to answer another question on that.
For more on this, I'm joined by Liberal MP Michael Sukkar. He's in our Melbourne studio, and Labor MP Elena McTiernan is in our Perth studio today. Thanks both for your time, and to start with you, Michael, let's try to clear this up. We know this remains in the AFP guidelines, but we haven't been told today why this directive was taken out of the ministerial directive.
Well, Tom, the guidelines are the document that dictate the protocols of our law enforcement agencies when they are dealing with foreign law enforcement agencies with these matters. And I would echo the comments of the Foreign Minister when she said that it's quite outrageous that 24 hours after what is quite a tragic circumstance, the Labor Party would try to make politics out of this. it's clear that the guidelines as they applied and were changed in 2009 by the Labor Party are still in application. Those guidelines are still the rules that dictate the protocols that the Australian law enforcement agencies use. And, you know, you wonder why Australians become so aggravated with Australian politics and Australian politicians when in a time like this, when the strongest thing that we should be doing is standing together on all sides of politics as a single parliament in supporting the Chan and Sukkar families and also our diplomatic measures with Indonesia. You now have the Labor Party coming out trying to quibble and make the most ridiculous arguments just for purely political reasons. And I just, you know, I think of the pub test in my electorate of Deakin, and I just think most people would shake their head and just say, you politicians just fight for the sake of it. Let me be clear. The protocols and the regulations as they apply have not changed, and I think that should be the end of it. And I'm surprised that the Labor Party are not too ashamed to even be raising this.
Can I just try to clear up, though? I accept what you're saying about the guidelines. Labor has asked why the directive, not the guidelines, was changed. If we want to refute that argument, we just need to know why. Was it not relevant? Is it something that could be taken out without impact? We just haven't had a response to that question.
Well, I suspect the directive deals with a range of matters that our law enforcement agencies would take into account, and perhaps that given the explicit nature of the guidelines, it's no longer necessary that a ministerial directive be relevant here because it's an accepted part of the protocols that the legal agencies use. So if it's now an accepted part of their arrangements, then I don't think a ministerial directive would be required any longer.
Okay, Alana McTiernan, how do you sit with that explanation? And it's worth noting as well, this letter was written, released by Labor before they had an answer on the day of the executions. Couldn't you have sought, if the real concern was future Australians, you could seek counsel, could you not, behind closed doors?
Well, look, can I just say this, that the Labor Party made a very conscious decision not to talk about any of the matters concerning the AFP in the lead up to the executions. We wanted the focus to be entirely on the case that the government was pleading with Indonesia, and we were absolutely lockstep with them on that. But obviously, once the executions had taken place, there's a huge issue out there in the public. The public are absolutely concerned about why it was that the AFP gave this information to the Indonesian police, and this part of looking at then what Labor's response was, what we did when we came into government to deal with what was a very, very worrying decision by the AFP was to put in place two things. Two levels. One is a guideline, and as a guideline, as the word suggests, it is a guideline, it is not a rule. And the other was the stronger provision, which was in fact a ministerial direction. So we judged that it was important that we have these two layers, one the guidelines and the other the ministerial direction, to ensure that something like this didn't happen again. Now, we said nothing.
Okay.
We said nothing during the lead up because we were not wanting to compromise the negotiations. But I think people out there, there's a demand for some answers to this. Why the AFP did it? Clearly, was it within their legal ability to do so? But how did they think that this was a sensible thing to do, particularly coming only a year after the last execution in Singapore?
I'm just going to jump in there, Alana McTiernan, because we need to move on. I've got a couple more topics to cover, including the GST. How are you going convincing perhaps some of your colleagues that WA needs more share of this? You are still a pretty wealthy state comparatively.
No, look, my concern about the GST, I support the idea that we've got to share this up so each state can give equal services to their community. That's part of being an Australian. But what we've got is the Grants Commission's rulings are absolutely absurd. They do not properly account for Australia's remoteness. Let me give you an example. They say this. They say things get more expensive as you go out from the capital city, but once you hit 1,217 kilometres, it doesn't get any more expensive. Now, of course, WA just happens to be the place that's got all these places that are 1,500, 2,000, 3,000 kilometres from the capital city, and so the formulas are really wrong, and they become even more bizarre. We've now got
right, we'll see.
Hobart.
Sorry, I'm just going to have to jump in there
Melbourne
because
is the capital
we're a bit short of time. But Michael Sukkar, if I can turn to you on this, because Malcolm Turnbull, Politics in the Pub last night was his event. He said that WA has every reason to feel aggrieved. Sometimes we all say what we actually mean in the pub. Is this a bit of an indication of where the government's going to shift on this?
Well, look, I think everyone is very parochial around GST, and as a Victorian I can say that from the commencement of the GST, Victoria has always received less in GST than we have paid, and I think broadly, as an economic powerhouse, most Victorians understand that we need to cross-subsidise some other areas of the country. I think 15 years on from the introduction of the GST, there's nothing wrong with looking at the formula, looking at how appropriate it is. Obviously, our economy has changed, population growth and demographics change on a yearly basis. So I don't think there's anything wrong with looking at the formula, seeing how appropriate it is now. But I think it's very easy for, political purposes for every politician from their own state to get quite parochial about it and argue that their state should have more of a slice of the GST. I think from a Victorian perspective, yes, of course we'd love more of our GST, but we broadly accept as an economic powerhouse that we should subsidise some other states, and I would leave it to the Grants Commission, but agree with the general sentiment that there's nothing wrong with looking at the formula 15 years on and making sure it's as appropriate today as it was when the GST was introduced.
All right, I guess we'll see more in that July retreat with the PM and a few state ministers and premiers. We are right out of time for the panel, but Michael Sukkar, Alana McTiernan, thanks as ever for your company.
Thanks, Tom.
A quick break now. We're going to come back and talk about homelessness, an ongoing issue in Australia. Stay with us.
Enjoy beautiful feet every day with the exciting innovation in foot care, the Scholl Express Pedi. It has a microlumina roller head with diamond crystals that exfoliates your feet, making easy work of hard skin, leaving your feet feeling soft and smooth. So for this Mother's Day, give your mum soft, beautiful feet effortlessly with the Velvet Smooth Express Pedi with diamond crystals. Stand up for feet with Scholl.
My Uncle Tom is the best. I love spending time with him. He lives in a really cool place in the city and drives an awesome new Holden Cruise, a red one. He has a turbo engine. You don't have to be in the car to start it. It looks so cool from the outside. One day Uncle Tom will let me in it.
New Cruise, now from $19,990 drive away.
Let's go there.
Heroes Charge.
Lead your heroes in the hit mobile game. Download Heroes Charge now.
Better in the wet? Travel well? Check. Opposition ruckman out? Check. But have you checked Luxbet? Our daily Maximizer specials are designed to maximise your returns this season. So before you bet, check Luxbet.
Luxbet.com.
Which companion will you pick? Farm Heroes, download now.
When it comes to big decisions like our home loan, why do we only ask our bank's opinion? A second opinion from Aussie doesn't cost you anything, and it could save you thousands. It could be the most valuable second opinion you'll ever get.
Welcome back to the program. Well, as wealthy a country as Australia is, the number of homeless people in the country remains stubbornly high. Anglicare Australia says 105,000 people do not have a safe and secure place to sleep in each night. And a key part of the problem is rental affordability. They've released their 6th annual rental affordability snapshot, collating data from 65,000 properties available across the country on April 11 this year. I spoke with Anglicare Australia's Casey Chambers a short time ago.
The whole of the capital cities across Australia were totally unaffordable for people on Newstart or the Dole. We surveyed 65,614 properties across Australia on the weekend of the 11th of April. Over 51,000 of those were in our capital cities, and out of that 51,300, only one property was affordable for somebody who was living on Newstart. Less if you're on youth allowance, less than one. So it's a pretty dire situation when we think that the capital cities, Sydney, Perth, Melbourne, that's where the work is, and that's what we want people who are on Newstart to be doing. It's a pretty desperate situation when they can't afford to live there.
And these figures do factor in rental assistance as well?
They do. What we do is we look at the number of properties available, we look at what type of housing they are. For single people, we count share housing as well, and then we look at what people's income is on various types of government benefit, whether it be the age pension, disability support pension, Newstart, also the minimum wage. And we factor in for various households that have children, we factor in the family tax benefit A and B if appropriate, and also Commonwealth rental assistance, and even down to where we have a couple, how they split their tax. And that's the figures we use. So it's a pretty robust survey, I have to say. The numbers of properties that we survey and the data that we use to assess affordability.
You think one of the solutions could be to ramp up basically building of social housing in Australia?
That's right. One of the things we've seen over recent decades is the decrease of public housing. Add to that, we've seen a lowering of housing affordability for people to buy, and pretty large population growth. So those three things together have really made the private rental market have a lot more people looking to rent than houses available for rent. So we desperately need to ramp up the social housing. Mum and dad investors will invest in one house, maybe two houses, but we actually need to be looking at some larger scale investments, particularly for people who are at the very lower end of this, who are on government benefits, or even, as we say, on the minimum wage. People on the minimum wage, even they did not fare well in this survey.
They fared a lot better.
They did fare better. I'm just looking at my figures so I get it completely right.
There are a few thousand available for them.
Yeah, but out of those whole 65,500, if you were a single person on the minimum wage, 2.3% of them would have been affordable. If you were a single parent on the minimum wage, and again factoring in the family tax benefits and the Commonwealth rental assistance, it was 3.3%. Now, we would contend that the private rental market is the very part of the housing market that is, the government would probably say is designed, that's where we would see people on a minimum wage looking for their housing. But clearly it's not working for people even on a minimum wage.
You talk about ramping up social housing. That obviously takes a while. There's also NIMBYism, if you like, not in my backyard. People don't want these big clumps of houses.
Yeah.
So what about increasing rental assistance instead, and not having people in these big pockets, but simply making houses more affordable for them?
That's right. I mean, I guess most of our recommendations are in two areas. One is about increasing the amount of income for the person themselves. We can't not say, we can't go past the fact that inadequate income is a severe factor in this. We have very low income for people, so we need to look at that. But we also need to look at how we actually supply the housing and how we actually encourage people to supply that housing. And we're also talking about things like negative gearing. That's an enormous enormous amount coming out of the federal revenue, and it's currently untargeted. So if you're on the dole or if you're on disability support pension, there are things that you're expected to do in return for that pension. We have no such obligation on negative gearing. So it's a massive output. Figures this week from NatSem have put it at $7.7 billion out of the Commonwealth revenue for negative gearing and capital gains tax.
Now, all of your figures are based on this affordability, meaning spend 30% of your salary or payments, whatever they might be. Is that a realistic figure with such a booming property market, and given plenty of people pay a lot more than that for their mortgages?
Yeah, we apply that to people on the lowest incomes. If you're on 150,000, sure, you can afford 50% of that possibly on housing. But when we look at what the minimum wage is per annum, it's about $33,300, slightly over that if you're working full time. If you take 30% of that, that leaves you around about $23,000 for everything else. You put your transport to and from work, your utilities, your food, everything. If you're on New Start, you're on a little over $13,000 a year. So if you take 30% of that, it leaves very, very little. So the rule that we apply, it's
so 30% really is specific to the low income.
It's nationally accepted that that's a good target for housing affordability. In a couple of areas, we have run a ruler over our data at 40% of income and 50%. It doesn't make it that more affordable, I have to say.
It gets up to a few percent, does it? Or?
Yeah. But when we actually think about people on New Start, there's 40 or 30% of this amount of money is still not very much.
Obviously the end game to all of this is affordability can mean homelessness, and it's a pretty tough lifestyle. We're coming up to winter here in Canberra. It's tough sometimes to run from the house to the car on those cold mornings, so I guess that's the ultimate thought here, isn't it, how tough it can be out there?
That's right. And also we have to say, that while we're looking at the percentages of these properties that are affordable, it doesn't mean that people would actually get them. There's huge competition. And some of these properties, they're not going to be the best properties on the market, the ones that are the most affordable. They're going to be difficult to heat. They're going to be difficult to keep cool in summer. They're going to have damp potentially. So it's not a great environment. And it might be a step up from homelessness, but it's often a very small step between a very low paid rental and homelessness.
Just quickly, any response from the Minister in this sort of area? Some perhaps money available in the budget, or?
Oh, you'd have to ask him that, I guess. One of the things that we're saying, though, is that this is not a quick fix solution. It's not all within the Minister for Social Services portfolio. It's right across government portfolios. It's right across different levels of government. And what we're calling for is some leadership from the federal government to work with their state and territory counterparts and with local governments to actually solve this kind of crisis. Because if we've got this in housing, it's going to affect people's employment, it's going to affect their participation, their children's education, and ultimately people's health.
Casey Chambers, thanks for your time today.
Thank you.
Proved to be a bit of an intractable issue. Both sides of Parliament certainly trying to do their best, but remains a big issue in Australia, homelessness. That's it for the program today. Stay with us, though. We've got Newsday coming up with Liz.